Now, Oral Roberts University made it all the way to the Sweet 16, but they're in the headlines for not the reason you would think. We can disagree on other stuff, and I'm good with a principled pluralism on a bunch of other things, but not these. By nature, that's totalitarian.
Either you agree with that based on the history of the church and its relationship with LGBTQIA, or on the other side, it's just like, hey, this is just the standard traditional belief that's been held for 2,000 years of Christendom, and it's just kind of like, yeah, some of the beliefs that Christians hold will be offensive to modern culture.
Whatever side you land on, do it with compassion, with courage. Welcome to Kingdom Thinking. This is our second episode on cancel culture. If you haven't seen our first one, it's all good. I want to invite you to click on the link and check out our first take on revisiting cancel culture as Christians. How should we respond to it? What we want to talk about today is this peculiar situation with Oral Roberts University and the take on this sports journalist and what she wrote in the tournament. So can you briefly summarize for us?
Yeah, so basically, in light of, ORU is a small school in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And they made it all the way to the Sweet 16, which is something that never really happens, right? To hear this tiny school in the same sentence as like a powerhouse like Duke or Kentucky or Kansas, all the good schools that are fun to watch. And so they make it all the way in. But what happens is when you do that, right, like you were saying, light gets kind of shined on you as a school. You make more money. You become more attractive to potential recruits going on down the line. So there's you don't even necessarily have to win the whole tournament in order to benefit substantially from it, right? And so there is a sports journalist, Hamal Javeri of USA Sports. She writes this article basically cautioning, right, sports fans and the NCAA to not really view ORU as the 2021 Cinderella story, but rather as somebody to be suspicious of. Right. And so there was kind of a big deal for that, right? And she has some quotes here that are probably just worth reading as opposed to us trying to interpret her words for her.
Her own words.
Yeah, so she says, and I quote, the NCAA should have never permitted Oral Roberts to participate in the national tournament due to the institution's apparently bigoted, out-of-date, homophobic, prejudicial views on marriage, gender, and sexuality. Okay. She goes on to say, as the spotlight grows on Oral Roberts and it reaps the goodwill, publicity, and the revenue of a national title run, the university's deeply bigoted anti-LGBTQ plus policies can't and shouldn't be ignored. The school's values are not just a, quote, relic of the past, but wholly incompatible with the NCAA's own stated values of equality and inclusion. And lastly, she writes, the call of this USA Today columnist is for the NCAA to disqualify ORU and any school who holds its values from postseason NCAA play, as well as membership from the NCAA wholesale, end quote.
So these are really strong words. Yeah. She's not mincing any punches. There's no ambiguity about where she stands on this. Yeah. Now, this is interesting to me because, to be clear, Oral Roberts University, their players, their coach, president, there was nothing in particular that happened. There was no statement, no event, no thing that led to this, right? This is a response to their existence and their adherence to traditional Christian beliefs on marriage and sexuality. Right. So this ushers up and brings the question again of how should Christians respond to the pushback, to the responses, and potentially to the calls for cancellation, in this case, disqualification from collegiate sports and basketball. Like, this is pretty serious, right? So, I mean, first let me get some thoughts on that, because on the one hand, I'm not much of a person who makes a big deal out of some of these things. I don't really think that there's a lot that Christians should fear persecution from in the U.S. Of all places. And I don't particularly, or I haven't in the past seen something like the LGBTQ movement as a threat. Now, having said that, I want to get your thoughts, because the way that this is worded and the calls for total disqualification, because it's not, in other words, there was another place where she said that the institution's stance on these things are no longer in line with like common human decency. Right. To word something like that has drawn the line in the sand and kind of reevaluated the perspective and the value set.
Yeah.
Let me get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we see here is somebody for whom the Overton window has clearly shifted. And so we've talked about the Overton window here before, right? Like what's acceptable dialogue and then what needs to just be banished wholesale, right? So we would all agree that like traditional Nazi sympathizers in the way that's like historically understood would be out of the Overton window, right? Just like to give an extreme example.
Okay.
And so what this writer has done, right? She has from the traditional Christian perspective, she has shrunk that Overton window to where Christians no longer belong to that conversation. And so that becomes an interesting sticking point.
Correct.
In an attempt to dialogue, because really what that has done is that has completely closed the door to any type of dialogue, right? Because it's outside of what's this acceptable commentary in the social, in the town square, right, as it were. And so either you agree with that based on the history of the church and its relationship with LGBTQIA kind of individuals, right, and a lot of like some of the potential what's considered like mental harm and the trauma that people have had to unpack and coming from that, or on the other side, it's just like, hey, this is just the standard traditional belief that's been held for 2,000 years of Christendom. And it's just kind of like, yeah, some of the beliefs that Christians hold will be offensive to modern culture, and it just kind of is what it is.
Yeah. The first thing you said is where I want to camp on for a little bit, because that's exactly right. I think what's happening is, and again, I'm hesitant to say, is this just the boogeyman or is this real?
Sure.
Like, you know what I mean? I feel that tension. But I think, at least as it pertains to this article that was written, it really is equating something like a traditional view on, hey, I have a conviction on human sexuality based on my religion. That's now being equated to something like racial slurs, like something like white supremacy, like things that are like, whoa, these are really bad things. We're not even going to dignify that with a response. It's kind of like, and I don't say this flippantly, but you know how like when there's a lot of shootings and then these people write manifestos, a common response to that would be like, no. What they want is for us to read that. We're not even going to dignify that. That doesn't even belong in our discourse because it's so far off of anything that's rational. I kind of feel like what she's proposing is, hey, we should see these archaic and irrational and oppressive and some language that I've heard from other people is violence. Yeah. The violence and hate and et cetera, et cetera. It's the same thing.
Sure.
And I'm like, that's interesting. Because if that's what you're saying, then it's a non-starter.
Yeah.
Then what you're asking isn't for tolerance. You're asking for me to completely wholesale abandon something that you're accusing me of being bigoted. You see what I'm saying? So that's different.
Yeah. I mean, it's a completely different movement.
Now, granted, not everybody is saying this, right? To be fair, not everybody of the pro-LGBTQIA perspective is that. But this particular instance of saying this school should not participate in the NCAA, they shouldn't even be allowed to be part of collegiate athletics, that's a strong call.
Yeah, well, and so people who are proponents of that, or people who would hold and say that this is not a boogeyman, right, who would say that before, 10 years ago, you would see this type of rhetoric in, like, Salon articles, right, like super far left, way progressive left, but now it's made its way into USA Today, right. Which tends to be understood as a more mainstream publication of sorts, right? And so people who would support the idea that this isn't just a boogeyman, but there is something to fear for American Christians here is like saying like, no, we don't fit in the public discourse anymore, right? And there and so there has been a movement of that rhetoric from more fringe discussion type stuff to far more mainstream kind of outlets and discussions and those types of things. So there is, it's not a boogeyman wholesale, right? And so there is a conversation to be had with those types of things, but it's an oddity in one sense because this is not calling for a conversation. And I would imagine, right, that if you spoke to Hamal, she would probably just say like, yeah, I don't want to have a conversation. Like we have decided as a society that it's time to move beyond this. And if you're a proponent of that belief, you would agree with that. You would say, you look at the historical way that American Christians have treated LGBTQ communities, particularly, in the 80s and 90s during the first AIDS epidemic and as things were running and how poor the church response was, say like it's archaic and it's detrimental and it is violent, right? In some sense in terms of the mental trauma that it does. So it's time for us to move beyond that, right? And to shut you out of the public discourse because there's no room for you anymore.
Correct. So to the degree that is in effect what the call is, then, I mean, I have a few thoughts on the logic of that.
Sure.
And then I want to talk about 3 possible responses to essentially a call to cancel this particular school in the tournament, right?
Yeah.
So my first thought is I have a hard time seeing the consistency in the values that someone of this perspective is claiming and the actual call and what she thinks should be done because of those values.
Right.
To stand for inclusion and equality and tolerance, but to do so only for your guild members or for those who agree with you, it seems that it cheapens the actual value because you're not actually standing for inclusion and tolerance. You're standing for a call to agree with your perspective.
Right.
Or bust.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what that does is there's no middle ground for disagreement. It's an all or nothing take. And that's where I think things get dangerous because at least as I understand, principled pluralism, a perspective where you can have some sort of fundamental core values and have areas of disagreement, like freedom of religion assumes principled pluralism, right? Like you don't have to be a Christian or a Muslim or you can believe in whatever deity you want, right? Like that's generally a good thing. But if the conversation continues to move where there's ethics or values that are no longer negotiable, then there's no middle ground.
Right.
Now, granted, we shouldn't pretend that we don't have those, right? Because we do. We put people in, we remove people from society who kill other people.
Right.
Yes, we do that. But to put something like sexual ethics or a perspective on marriage and human sexuality in that is really interesting to me. I don't think it's new, but I'm starting to feel more compelled towards, now wait a minute.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, because definitely what happens is with this is like the broad strokes of what used to be the Overton window have been tightened. No doubt. I mean, you can't be just, I mean, if you spend 10 minutes on Twitter, Instagram, right? Like you'll see this, right?
Okay.
And like Twitter has in the past, I've heard people reference it as like the bathroom wall of the internet, right? And it tends to become more like that. It feels like the more I'm on it. But the idea behind all this being like the Overton window has no doubt shifted, and it seems to have gotten tighter. And the problem with this, in this kind of idea of like pluralism's Achilles heel, both religiously speaking and and societally speaking, is like who determines what's the acceptable, who determines the guardrails, right, for the discussion. And it's just will always be whoever's in power. And so the response that you would get from the other side of that would say like, yeah, and it's been white, conservative, heteronormative males who have held power in this country's history for its, entire existence. And this is a way of kind of pushing back against that. So you're not really being persecuted, as it were. It's just more of like hey, we are making elbow room at the table since we have been forced out for so long.
Interesting.
Right? And I mean, there's a historical argument to be made there, no doubt.
There has to be a totalitarian element to securing a core center of which values are non-negotiable.
Sure.
At some point, when you decide these are the core values that, like, we can disagree on other stuff, and I'm good with a principled pluralism on a bunch of other things, but not these, by nature, that's totalitarian.
Sure.
Right? By nature, that is demanding, not requesting, the acquiescing of the other person. To be part of the society, you have to acquiesce to that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so the call for all people of modern society to have to now adopt this perspective, this ideology with reference to marriage and sexual ethics, I think there's warrant and merit there to say like, okay, like, well, we got to respond in some way. So there's 3 Christian authors that offered a response to this.
Yeah.
And let's look at some of the merits, some of the strengths, and maybe potentially some of the weaknesses of their views. So the first one is Al Mohler. Al Mohler is the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, very respected thinker in a lot of conservative evangelical circles. So he writes the following. He says, "The gauntlet has been thrown. The challenge has been given in a publication that bears the masthead of USA Today. Make no mistake, this may be about Oral Roberts University today, but the same will be said about you and your school or your church or your organization tomorrow. Count on it. All the scare words in this article about bigotry, phobia, regressive sexist policies, and fundamentalist morality, and wildly out of line with modern society and the basic values of human decency, will soon be directed at any Christian institution that dares to defy the new moral order. The only question remains, will your school capitulate or stand firm in the truth of God and the promise of his word? Whether you realize it or not, you are making that decision right now. So what I understand Al Mohler's position to be is this is already happening and the ball's rolling.
Right.
Because it's not on the basis of their university, right? It's on the basis of the specific ethic. So if they can do that to a university, they're going to do it to anybody who has that same ethic.
Right.
So you're either going to stand firm in your conviction or flop.
Right.
I understand this, and I don't know. I'm having a hard time kind of reading the undertones.
You don't sound like you're fully there yet with it.
No, well, so I'm trying to understand if he's calling for a fight, like we got to fight this, or if he's saying like, hey, just get ready for persecution because it's happening. How do you read it?
Yeah, as the latter, right? Like, hey, this is coming down the pipe. Just be ready.
Just be ready.
Coming
Okay.
down the pipe.
Gotcha. So what do you think about that perspective?
Yeah, I don't think he's wrong. I mean, there will probably be a time where we become so post-Christian that anything Christian-related is offensive, right, to modern sensibilities. And that's okay. I mean, like, that seems probably like a good way to go. You know, I kind of, a large part of me cheers for that, right, when I think about, like...
Say more about that.
Well, then I think about the effectiveness of the church.
That's a confusing sentiment.
When I think about the church's effectiveness in the first 400 years of its existence before it becomes the main religion of Rome, right, I tend to want to kind of get back to that world, at least theoretically.
I see what you're saying.
You know, because I think anytime we mix Christianity with power on a political level, I think it's
vulnerable to distortion.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's almost always bad.
Yeah.
There. Like, I'm hard-pressed to think of, like,
I see what you're
awesome,
saying.
great times.
So, the compelling, the attractiveness of Christianity was that it was a minority. It was
entirely countercultural.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's interesting. And, did they suffer persecution? Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was part of the deal.
Yeah.
Dude, biting the bullet with that. I mean, in principle... Right, I'd like to think like, oh yeah,
that's
but
why.
So like, what does that mean? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to like not be able to feed my family? You know what I mean? However, if you actually believe these things to be true, then like, that's what it means to bite the bullet.
Yeah,
it might mean that.
Right.
True. Then there's Ed Stetzer.
Mm-hmm.
He's a dean at Wheaton College, so another Christian institution, probably less conservative than Southern Baptist, maybe more central. More moderate. And so he's kind of relaying the concern of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. And this quote is interesting to me. It says, faith-based higher education has always been an essential element of the diversity of higher education in the U.S. Many of the first colleges and universities in the U.S. were religious, and it's essential that protections for LGBT persons be paired with essential religious freedoms that maximize freedom for all. So one of the interesting things that he wrote about was how he understands the backdrop for this conversation to be the Equality Act.
Yeah.
And so
he's using the same language, right?
In a way, but I think this is kind of highlighting a different point.
Mm-hmm.
And the point that it's highlighting is not only the inconsistency, but the call to reason.
Right.
Like, hold on, like, hey, we're all for protections. Like, we don't think anybody should be bullied.
Right.
And if you want to identify as a particular gender or live your lifestyle a certain way, we're not interested in bullying you.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't want to be bullied either.
Right.
It seems more of a call to reason.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are I don't know, like, are you hopeful that a call to reason would be effective at this point where, like you said, right?
Yeah, not particularly.
The center has shifted.
Yeah, I don't know that you can, because as I try to continue to understand the conversation from the LGBTQ plus perspective, it's like my very existence is offensive to you, right? And when I think about it from that perspective, it's like, yeah, I understand why it's such a frustration from that understanding where it's like I'm not even allowed to, exist well in terms, like I can exist, but I can't live a meaningful life under your understanding, right? And so his pushback, the only thing is like, well, you don't have to associate with us. You don't have to be in our circles. You don't have to listen to our media, consume our content, or do anything like that. You're well free to live your own parallel life in America, and that's what makes it great there. But as things get smaller, and as the world gets smaller, and as the countries get smaller,
you mean like more interconnected?
Yeah, I mean just through technology, just through higher density of population, right? Like I just don't think that we can keep moving in parallel circles in the same way. Right?
Interesting. So this is inevitable.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then there's Dr. Jim Denison. He's a founder of like a media apologetics channel. And he says, hey, given the situation, there might not be a clear prescription on how to move forward, but there's two principles that I think are really important. That's what he says. He says, number one, be courageous. Number two, be compassionate. So if you can discern the situation of what is it fight? Is it go say, no, we need legislation to protect religious liberties? Is it call to reason? Is it, just let it happen? Whatever side you land on, do it with compassion and with courage. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the most logically sound approach to me, right? Because it's going to be the thing that we're probably going to end up having to have conversations about anyway, right? Because eventually we're going to get to a point where we just don't toe, where you either can't toe the line or you have to abandon historical orthodoxy, right? And if you feel like there's precedent to abandon historical orthodoxy, like we see churches doing that in some conversations. So
denomination splitting.
Yeah, so to pretend like it's not happening is foolish. So you either have to go that route or you just have to be okay with being ostracized.
Taking the consequences.
Or just being considered to be like a bigot or a homophobe or a racist, or, you have to be okay with being steeped in those titles, right? And then you rely on principles like Jesus' words when he says, the world will hate you, but take heart, it hated me first, but I've overcome the world. You have to really cling to those promises. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to really exist well, in that spot.
Interesting. So. Yeah, I mean, this is one instance of a sticky situation like that. And I think you're right. I think we can anticipate a lot more happening in different industries, in different circles. So what do you guys think? Which of the three responses felt most compelling or most interesting to you? Make sure to leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Tune in next time on Kingdom Thinking.